Hello everyone. I have a question for you today. Have you ever known anyone that's fallen asleep in church or during the sermon? Perhaps you have fallen asleep at some time during worship or during the sermon, especially if the sermon is long. How long do your pastors preach? Do they go 15 minutes or 25 minutes or an hour or an hour and a half? We have a story from the book of Acts, which is about the Apostle Paul, who was preaching and talking with people at an early church service. We have a description, one of the earliest descriptions of an early church service. And Paul is preaching for quite a long time. And Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, by the way, he wrote Luke, the Gospel, and also the book of Acts. Luke is giving an eyewitness account of what happened here. Paul is on his way to Jerusalem eventually. He's going to some of the churches that he has started and that have been important to him. He's going to go back and forth between Turkey, Asia Minor, and Greece, and Macedonia, and eventually he's going to go to Jerusalem, where he knows he will be arrested and put up on trial. And so he's taking a long time with a lot of these churches and these friends. And here he is, he's at Troas, which is in western Turkey on the Aegean Sea. And this is in the book of Acts chapter 20. And we're going to start down at verse 6. And this is, Luke is giving almost like a diary. He says, we did this, we went these places. And so we know that he saw these things. In verse 6 he says, but we sailed away from Philippi, which is in Greece, Macedonia, after the days of unleavened bread, which would be Passover. And in 5 days we joined the others at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. And some of these others would include Timothy. We have the books of Timothy that Paul wrote to Timothy. Timothy became one of the most important leaders in the early church. And so they joined Timothy and others at Troas. And they stayed there a week, 7 days. And then it says in verse 7, now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. So they broke bread, they had dinner together. This is a beautiful description of the early church. They just didn't gather together, sing a hymn, and have a sermon and go home. They fellowshiped together. They shared a meal together. Many of the worshipers in the early church were slaves. It's one place where slaves were welcome, as well as rich people, and they could join together as one family. It's something that was quite beautiful, the worship experience of the early church, which included the meal and the breaking of bread, which would be communion. But here they are, the first day of the week, and which would be Sunday, the Lord's Day. And they are breaking bread, having a meal, and Paul preaches until midnight. Well, that's longer than an hour or 2 hours or even 3 hours maybe. And perhaps they're having conversation as well, dialogue. But it goes until midnight. And the person that I'm going to be talking about right now is a man called Eutychus. 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 He is the person that is little known in the Bible and yet has an important place in the book of Acts for this story. It says in verse 8, there were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered. So it was dark, it was midnight, they had these lamps going. It was kind of they believe a lower ceiling and these lamps. Can you imagine how when it gets hot in a room and you get sleepy And that can happen to any of us. And it says, in a window sat a certain young man named Eutychus, and he was sinking into a deep sleep. So Eutychus found a place near a window which would be open and trying to get some cool air, because it was probably so warm in that room, and things have been going on a while, and he might have just been a teenager or a young man, and it was time. He may have been a slave, maybe he worked hard all day, and it was time for him to take a nap. But he was in the window, and that created a problem, because it says he was overcome by sleep. And as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. So he was third story. Today that'd be about 30 feet up in the air or so. He fell backwards out the window and he was dead. He died. It says in verse 10 then, but Paul went down and fell on him and embraced him, and I'm sure prayed for him. And he said, do not trouble yourselves, for his life is in him. So Paul says he's not dead now. He was, but he's come back to us. And it says, now when he had come up, had broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even until daybreak, he departed. So Paul continued to talk. Eutychus was alive. He went back up, probably listened some more. Paul talked till morning. And then it says he departed. And they brought the young man in alive, and they were not a little comforted. So they found great comfort in the fact that Paul had been able to bring life back into this young man, Eutychus. So Eutychus is an example of someone it's very real. He fell asleep. Isn't the Bible descriptive? And it's very real, because why else would they say that someone fell asleep during Paul's preaching? Paul, the great apostle. But he fell asleep and was dead when he fell. And yet Paul prayed over him, embraced him, and life came back into him. That's a message that was comforting for the people of Troas. The word spread, I'm sure, about what had happened. And I think it's very interesting that we know this young man's name, Eutychus. A long time ago I learned that people's names are only mentioned in the Bible if they're special or if they're known by others. I don't know why Luke would say the young man's name unless others who were reading this, his gospel, when he wrote it, if they knew who Eutychus was. And so I believe that Eutychus became a leader in the early church. And it might even have gotten a chuckle out of them. There might be some humor here that, if we just read it seriously, we're missing. But maybe Luke is saying, well, you all know Eutychus, but here's something that happened to him that I want to share with you. He's very human. He's like the rest of us. And to me, in my mind, that's part of what's going on here. Paul and the early disciples were given powers to heal people. We have the book of Acts is full of healings and things that the disciples did, the apostles, and these things helped to bring people to Jesus because they got their attention. It was a miracle, and then they wanted to know more about him. So this is a great story about Eutychus, but it also gives us a glimpse into the early church. This is one of the first church meetings that we really get a glimpse of how they would spend time together, eating a meal together, and then breaking communion, breaking bread together, and sharing the bread and the cup. So it's a wonderful story, and it's one that reminds us that even sometimes when life seems gone out of us, gone out of a person, that we can be instilled with new life. And at these times when we are somewhat quarantined and kept in our own homes, and we can feel really down, it's good to know that the Lord brings revival to our spirits, and that we will have great revival again. And so I just pray for each of you and for your families and for your friends that we will find renewal of strength and faith in these times, and that we don't all just fall asleep and neglect the Lord, and that we find great renewal of faith. God bless you, and we'll do something from the Old Testament next time, and I believe it will be about a group of sisters who stand up for themselves, and it's an interesting story. God bless you all.